Welcome back to Sailing Trilleen for another week. This one's a little bit unusual. The past week I have had COVID, and so I have not been crawling around the boat fixing stuff. In fact, I can say that's 10 out of 10 I do not recommend as an experience, but I am doing okay and it looks like I'm going to be absolutely fine, which is a great relief. What I thought I'd do is I would address my post bag, so to speak. I have had a few questions, both about my sailing generally and about the problems that Trilleen is having with her mast at the moment. So, first question I'll come to was about my sailing generally, and that was a three-way question, which was how did I get into disability sailing, what do I get the most benefit from, and what was the most expensive thing that I have bought for Trilleen. It helps to know that I'd been into sailing since I was about 3 years old, and my parents dumped me into the bottom of a very small wooden sailing dinghy in the wet there as added ballast, I suppose, for their sailing adventures, and I enjoyed it. Why I enjoyed sitting in the wet in a freezing cold boat doing not very much, I don't know, but apparently I enjoyed it. I got into disability sailing because I was at the time in a nursing home and I'd been extremely unwell. I kind of got to the point where I was just thinking whether there was a way out of the home, and I started to look at things that were really important to me in terms of my previous life, so to speak, and which perhaps I'd neglected too much, and that I thought might have been part of what had created the circumstances where I could become as unwell as I had. For me, being in the wilds, outdoors, in wild places is really important and has always been really important. And since I knackered my spine and my mobility went down the tube, it hasn't been possible for me to get out and get my fix by going mountain walking or whatever. So I just stopped doing it. But the problem with that was that it deprived me of something that it turns out is really important to my whole being. So I started looking at sailing charities that help disabled people, because I thought that being out in the wild on a boat might be something that I could do. I had a few false starts with sailing charities that were doing really important work, and I respect and value their work a lot, but they weren't going to ever get me to a point of independence on the water. And I came across the Andrew Castle Foundation, and I just really liked their approach and the fact that they were very prepared to work hard with me and to expect me to work hard in return. And so I sailed with them for the best part of 2 years, the second year of which I was refitting Trilleen as well, and here I am. And the third question was, what's the most expensive thing that I have bought for Trilleen? The first thing is, the most expensive thing's the boat, right? I had to buy the boat when she was in a bit of a mess, and that by some measure is the most expensive thing. I think it's really difficult to it is really difficult to tell what the most expensive thing is when you're doing a refit, because so many things involve costs from so many different cost centres. But I think probably the two projects that were most expensive were the electrics and the heating. The electrics were expensive because I wanted to get them right, and I wanted to put in a backbone that was going to allow for expansion and do all the other good stuff. The heating was an expense that I couldn't avoid because I knew that I wanted to operate the boat in the north, and I also knew that I needed hot water for health reasons, so that I could do sterile and near sterile procedures without go through an inordinate amount of gas boiling water. They're both 20-30 year life upgrades to a boat, and you have to view them in that respect. Now on to some questions about the situation which Trilleen finds herself in at the moment, which is currently moored up in a marina without a mast. The first question is very basic, and that is, I keep referring to the problem as being a problem with the rig. What is the rig? I'm sorry, I should have explained this in more detail. The rig is an abbreviation that comes from the days of sail, where all boats were sailing boats, and it refers really to three components: the mast of the boat, the standing rigging, and the running rigging. So the standing rigging is the stuff that's always there, like the shrouds, the big steel wires that hold the mast up, and the running rigging, which is the stuff that controls the sails essentially. So that's stuff that goes in and out and up and down. That led on to another question, which was, why does it matter if the mast is bent? And that's a really interesting question. Actually, you want the mast to be bent, just you want it to be bent in the right way. And at the moment, this mast is bent in the right way and in the wrong way. So let me open that up a little bit. Most sailboat masts have what we call rake, which is a aftward bend in the mast, which is induced in them when they are made. And that is because you want the mast to stay in one sort of bend while it's up. You don't want it to do this, because that induces fatigue in the mast, and fatigue cracks, when they grow, can lead to sudden and unexpected loss of rig, often at very inconvenient points, and that can cause casualties and major damage to the vessel. So that the sort you want is the right sort of fore-aft bend. The sort I've got is the wrong sort, which is a lateral bend. Lateral bends are bad for all reasons. So they're bad for sailing reasons because they affect the sail shape, and they affect the sail shape differently on one tack to the other. So when the wind's on one side of the mast, you can see that the bend would change the shape of the sail in one way, and when it's on the other side of the mast, it will change the shape in the opposite way. And this sort of variation leads to very different performance, and even small bends can lead to really quite significant changes in performance. The real reason why the mast is condemned is because the forces that are involved in bending a mast in the wrong way so that it is permanently deformed are very large. Frighteningly large, actually, if you do the sums on Trilleen's mast, because it's a very hefty lump of aluminium. So if you remember what I said earlier about fatigue, the fear is that if you have exerted that much force on the mast, you might well have ended up with micro cracking inside the mast, and each one of those cracks will grow and probably lead to its loss at some point in the future. It's also true that a mast that is banana bent like mine is much more prone to bending in even more undesirable ways if any sort of unusual loads come on it. Someone else asked a question, which is a really good question, about why it takes so long to make a new mast. So let me explain the process to you in the beginning. So masts are made, in this case, of aluminium section. I'm not talking about wooden masts, and I'm not talking about exotics like carbon. That section is made by shoving a block of aluminium through a die at extremely high hydraulic pressure. So this is a bit like making pasta or squeezing icing out of a bag, and it produces this very finely structured aluminium shape which is an extrusion, and it has grooves in it, and it has flanges laid into it so that it's the right sort of strength and the right size, and it's got the slot for the sail to go up in it and all the rest of it. Many different mast shapes exist for different sorts of boats, and depending on the way the boat's rigged, it needs a different profile of mast, and depending on the size of the boat, it needs a different profile of mast, and depending on how tall the mast is, it also will need a different profile. Some of these masts are tapered so that they are thinner at the top than they are at the bottom. Trilleen's isn't, it's a very basic mast. If you're lucky, and we are in this case I believe lucky, there is actually some of the relevant section in the world made up already. It's sitting on a set of shelves somewhere in a big warehouse, and the mast manufacturer knows that it exists. That bit of section has to be put on a truck or a ship or an aircraft, and it has to be got to the mast factory, so to speak. When they get to the factory, the mast manufacturer will attach tens, maybe hundreds of fittings to the mast, and every single one of those is critical, and it really matters that it's all in exactly the right place, and it also really matters that all the corners that are cut into the mast, so that you need to cut holes into the mast, for example to let halyards in and out and cables in and out, those all have to be rounded off perfectly, because any sharp corners or rough edges can be a cause for cracks growing, and again those cracks can lead to the sudden and unexpected disassembly of the mast while sailing, which is not generally seen as acceptable. Mast factories don't have a huge amount of spare capacity, so before you can get the mast into production there has to be a slot for it, because these are not factories where they're making iPhones. They're factories with relatively small spaces and relatively small numbers of workers, so the production slot is often a problem to secure, and there's no one is ever in a situation where they want to go, oh it's alright, we can wait another 6 months for it. Like, everyone is in a hurry, and that's just the reality. But you need to have a slot for the mast before you can actually even start building it. Then once the mast is up wherever the boat is, you then need some riggers to come and set the rig up round the mast, and again that can take a surprising amount of time. Then you have to rerun all the electrics, and in this case we'll also have to change the mast foot, which will be some shipwright type work, which will just be one of those jobs that has to get done, right? There's a really interesting question, which was, do you make the new mast to match the sails, or are the sails made to match a mast, or how does it work? The answer is, well, in this case there's already a database which explains what this mast should look like, so we'll make another one like the database. But fundamentally you choose to make the mast based on some naval architecture equations which describe the righting force that the boat has, and the lateral force which the sails will put on it, and so on. So actually the mast and the keel are really the first things that get thought about when you build a sailboat, and everything else comes afterwards, if you like. It's a complicated dance, but you certainly don't lightly go into a situation where you need to change a mast and you change it for something different to what was there in the first place. But in this case, because the sails fitted on the last mast, we're very hopeful that they should just fit on the next mast. Although one of the questions is whether we'll have to put entirely new slides onto the mainsail, because the slides are the bits that go up inside the mast to hold the sail onto the front of the mast. And different masts have different sections for those slidey bits, and Trilleen's mast was made by a company called Kemp, who no longer exist, and they made the first of the Vancouver masts. Selden made the latter masts, and they have a different sort of groovy bit. So the question is whether the slidey bits are compatible with the groovy bits or not, and if they're not, then there's going to be some sewing involved, probably by a sailmaker, because there are quite a lot of slides and there's a lot of hand sewing to do. We don't seem to have any more questions, so I think I will call it quits there, and thank you very much for watching what is, I accept, a very different episode.